Welcome to the Documentary Media Centre. I'm John Costa and I've been joined by my colleagues Paul Reilly and also Professor Rich Hall. Thanks very much guys for joining us this afternoon. What we're going to do is we're talking a little bit about in this 2 or 3 hours and Paul and I have already done an introduction on Facebook and we had a very interesting conversation which I'm sure we'll touch on with Dawn Irving Bell from Edge Hill University on Wednesday about the new national teaching repository that she started. It's a fascinating project and I know you'll have some specific thoughts about that, Rich, and we're quite keen to hear what they are. But really what I want to talk to you about is, as educators, the three of us, the impact of COVID-19 on higher education. Obviously it's played out quite a lot in the media, as well as our own experiences of maybe being on campus or shielding. I just wondered what you thought of all your years in education so far. What kind of impact do you think COVID-19 is going to have on higher education? Is it going to disappear and be something that was an anomaly, or do you think it will bring about some real systemic change?
Well, it depends when the next kind of pandemic hits, doesn't it? You know what I mean? When we get kind of COVID 2023 or whatever, whatever it is. I think, and this is part of the, I guess this is part of the thing really. We're making assumptions in part, and institutions aren't kind of planning for kind of living with the pandemic. We kind of exist in a society that either wants to annihilate or ignore the virus, and we kind of exist within kind of, I guess, higher education institutions that pretty much want to ignore the virus, which is why students have been forced back to the halls of residence, why we're doing kind of unnecessary face-to-face teaching, why we're ignoring largely, although we're doing risk assessments, kind of until things get critical, the needs of, for instance, vulnerable teachers, teaching staff who are over 60, for instance, so there's an extent to which I think institutions mirroring the government are kind of making it up as they go along. Although within that, so tactically they're making it up as they go along. The political economics of it is very different. The political economics of it is that, and you see this in things like the government's or the DFE's restructuring regime, sort of documentation that suggests that any institution that is in financial stress because of this, and that might be because they're close to having an office for students trigger point because they don't have enough cash at hand at the bank, in order to kind of be within their kind of operating kind of envelope effectively. The government is very clearly looking to use this for the potential for financial stress, and there are a number of institutions that are in financial stress, to restructure them in around that kind of what we would call it a marketized kind of regime, but certainly under I guess connected to the Office for Students kind of value for money strategy. So there's a sense that institutions are kind of being reactive and acting kind of tactically. There's a broader political economic dynamic which is to kind of push that kind of privatization, that really deeply alienating privatization agenda that prioritizes particular disciplines around particular outcomes, which are about earnings, or about jobs, effectively. So we are seeing an acceleration at that point, I think, of thinking that suggests that the crisis can be used effectively to kind of ignore. Well, we're ignoring longer standing kind of structural problems within the sector that might be around access for Black students, students of colour, Black staff, students of colour, staff of colour, disabled staff, and women in higher education. We're kind of, though all of those kind of fault lines are being amplified, but there's no sense within institutions or within the kind of the broader strategy of the government that those are going to be addressed. Everything is on, this idea of value for money. Everything is on the student, whatever the student experience is. What does it look like this week? And then there's a sense of, oh well, we'll push this kind of online thing. All of that is playing out in real time. I don't get a sense that there is any sort of thought of what will happen after. We're kind of, everything's all in on vaccines, right? That's what it's kind of all in on. So there's no sense of, well, how do we use it in this moment to think about how society as a whole might deal with crises? You know, it's kind of more of the same. We'll ignore it. We'll get on. We'll do all of that. Whereas this could be a beautiful moment, a deeply human moment for thinking about, well, what does the pandemic mean for local communities? What does it mean for resource allocation in local communities? What does it mean for sharing knowledge in those local communities? And what's the role of universities in helping that? But so far, we're dodging that issue.
It's really interesting as well, the language that gets used by government, isn't it? Which is like, you know, we're going to fight the virus, we're going to attack it. I mean, it kind of felt very, there was a very kind of Churchillian moment at the beginning with Boris Johnson, sort of, you know, everyone's going to do their bit and, you know, we're going to beat it. And sort of, you know, Britishness will mean that we'll be able to defeat COVID-19. And when that ripples down into organisations, particularly big organisations like that have no real remit to change, as in like we can just muscle our way through. Of course, when you said when it's built on the fact that it's lots of money with students coming, it almost like it can't think in any other way because it's never been based around the community or the community of learners or that, you know, that link collegiately between students and teaching staff. It's always been dominated by management and senior management and the fact that the university is business-like and it's business as usual.
Well, I think the part of the problem is that for probably there was a bit of a switch in 07, 08, because it's not just the pandemic. We have you know, we're now whatever 12 years into the politics of austerity, which is also kind of filtered through into higher education in terms of funding, in terms of regulation, governance, in terms of priorities around value for money, for instance, which comes, and the market coming to kind of dominate effectively, and your rights therefore emerging around your ability to pay down your debts, to contribute in a marketized economy, all of that kind of stuff. And so institutions have effectively been regulated around that for the last kind of decade, which means that the cultures that operate inside institutions, their practices, their everyday activities, they're all marketized. They're all based on performance management. They're all based on overt forms of managerialism, which frankly make people ill. They catalyze overwork. They catalyze overwork as self-harm. They catalyze people, and we see it during the pandemic because we see those people who are not able to conduct their work during the working day because they've got caring responsibilities for someone who's poorly or for children or for whatever it is. And the argument is, well, get up at 3 a.m. and do it then. Well, you know, you'll have to work in the evenings when you've bathed your kids then. And that falls disproportionate. It doesn't fall on people who look like me, you know, absolutely does not fall upon people generally who look like me. It is the people who have always been marginalized inside those institutions, and increasingly so in the last kind of decade, who are also feeling the squeeze now as we get that intersection of epidemiological and financial crises that kind of feed off each other. So we have cultures, I think, that have emerged over the course of the last decade that I would describe as pathological. You know, they're diseased, frankly, you know, and they make people poorly, and they're grounded in competition, and therefore our engagement with communities is grounded equally in, you know, we talk about public engagement, we talk about impact and impactful work, but it's still grounded in effectively the rule of money. You know, can you turn a surplus from these activities, or are they sufficiently brand aware that they are or impactful in terms of your brand, that they're going to attract students in, that they will attract other stakeholders in, that you will be able to in some way connect them to a Times Higher Education ranking, you know. So that is one of the problems, really, I guess, is that the ways in which institutions have been structured culturally, in terms of their structures internally, in terms of their cultures, their hierarchical competitive cultures, in terms of the activities that they enable, which have a particular kind of method to them, they're unable to act in any other way during a pandemic. It's like, other than acceleration, that's effectively all they've got, which is why we see people talking about burning out. It's the same in schools where you get those recent reports about the number of head teachers who are talking about leaving. It's too much, you know.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, John. Just to pick up on what you said before, I mean, this is not a new crisis. It's perhaps the the climax of a crisis which has been long building. And I think we've already started talking about casualization for fights. I mean, that there's now, I mean, the people who perhaps weren't fully invested in that fight originally, if you can call it that, are perhaps now using, well, the institution tell us they're in debt and they're threatening job losses. Therefore, we have to just drop all those things that are still persistent issues in the sector as if they've gone away, when actually in reality, they have been reinforced. And of course, never waste a crisis, because all the universities that have, threatened to dismiss or are dismissing staff, you do kind of think that that's an expedience rather than a necessity, because of course, most universities will claim that they're broke, when in reality, look at the assets that every university have, and certainly mine, the 100 million figure, which is still being bandied around without any proof at all. You just sort of sit there and think at times, if we're social scientists, certainly in my faculty, we should probably be questioning where that figure comes from and why that figure doesn't seem to include the voluntary severance scheme, which saved 13 million, or not using university buildings for 6 months, where you think that must be saving an awful lot of money that they're not declaring, because the motivation is efficiency, cost saving, and of course, turning profit.
Yeah. I mean, this is a fascinating conversation, isn't it? Really, because I think we're also at the point. I mean, as an industry practitioner and someone who isn't, an academic like you guys as well, I see so much emphasis put on the student experience, like open days and stuff like that, and some of the stuff that we saw with big trips overseas, and those kind of experiences. Whereas an industry practitioner, I kind of come onto the campus as a lecturer to teach those modules from the point of view of, it's great to get people to come onto the campus to see the opportunities that exist on the campus. Maybe, those young people that we work with in various organizations, maybe colleges as well, or those that are in care, to turn around and say, actually, you could easily hold your own if you came to university, so you're then dealing with this expectation of people that are there, which is, well, I'm here, I'm not really bothered, it's what I do, it's the way that I'm meant to do my career, I'm meant to do this. And other people where it is a genuine opportunity to maybe better themselves or go on and change the world. And so I'm kind of conflicted when I come onto campus and I see that. And I suppose really the language that gets used and bandied about, particularly around Build Back Better, is the fact that if you drill down and speak to any of those people, what they're actually saying to you is, we're going to build back like we did before, okay? So it will be better than before. It's not build back differently in order to make sure we're using it as a reboot to go back and revisit the fact that is it collegiate? Is it open to communities? Is it accessible? Is there equity? Is there equality? Rich, do you think there's an opportunity with COVID-19, or is this the start of several opportunities, all of which will come together as however long this pandemic situation lasts, because it could be 2 or 3 years, to actually bring around some real change? Or do you think the institutions will fight to return to what they know best and maybe the only way that they can function?
Well, there's the horizon of possibility, really. I mean, we own that horizon of possibility, but we are unable to. So we take your Build Back Better thing. We're unable to imagine anything different, because in part that Build Back Better is effectively how do we get back to normal. Yeah, not how do we look to integrate new patterns, new ways of working, new modes of engagement, new bodies, new ways in which we can connect with bodies, proper bodies, you know what I mean? The energy of bodies in rooms and all of that. We have this sense of Build Back Better, which actually ignores the glaring reality that all of that lost output, all of that lost economic output, unless you accelerate growth beyond the trend line that it was at originally, you ain't building back. That's in the same way that after the financial crash, you've lost that output. There are things you now cannot do, unless you generate excessive forms of debt, for instance, And this is one of the other problems, that institutions, in order to build back better, have to over leverage themselves against particular kind of student cohorts, and that's increasingly problematic, in particular in international cohorts of students coming in, or they have to over leverage themselves in bond markets or in those spaces, which then give them another set of kind of financial restrictions that are going to dominate what it is that they're able to do on top of the Office for Students kind of government kind of restrictions. Within this, you just have to look at the kind of the throughput of individuals at senior levels in institutions. There's such a churn at that level because you need to get badges on your CV so that you aren't PVC at Scumbag College, wherever, you know what I mean, or Poppleton University, because you want to be VC somewhere. So the commitment, and this is accelerated as well since 2008 in the financial crisis, and this is one of the issues now, is that churn still exists. There's an extent to which, if that churn exists within those institutions, how can those people who are in those institutions but not of them, how can they possibly help us, those of us who've been at institutions for 10, 15, 20 years or whatever, who live in communities that are served by those institutions, how can they help us work with those communities to build back differently? So there's a kind of there's a people thing and a status thing, and part of the problem here is the status and privilege that comes in university life. The roles, the role of the professor, the competition for tenure, the competition to become a pro vice chancellor or a head of department or whatever it might be. It's about status and privilege and all of that, and it's very hierarchical. So you almost don't want to imagine anything different, because you'll lose your status or your opportunity in that moment, and that's reinforced all the way up. And this is one of the problems, is that the current system, and it's not just higher education, it's the system of kind of social reproduction that we've got is predicated on us being separated out from each other and not brought together to do something different. And that's one of the problems, I think, with all of this. Didn't answer your question there, did I?
You did. I think one of the things that I find that too, I mean, I totally agree with what you just said there, is that, the managerialism and the sort of denialism about the pandemic, particularly in the past few months, where particularly the hygiene theatre, okay, we're not just seen it in higher education, other places too, put up stickers on the walls, on the floors, and tell people not to get close to each other, and it's safe, COVID secure. COVID secure, what does that mean? There is no such, for a virus which you cannot see, which can be spread airborne, that is complete fiction. But the sort of willingness of university managers at various levels to really push that as a way to force and compel, particularly staff who are probationers or on contracts, to go and do things that perhaps other members of staff cannot do, has been just one of those things where you do think the inequality that's being sort of sparked by this within institutions is only going to get worse, particularly when we have vaccines, which of course, John, you said about the vaccines perhaps being the change. They're not going to be for at least 12 months. I mean, if we have vaccination programs starting in December, and optimistically by March, and with this government, might be March 2023 or 24, arguably, we're not really going to be in a position where you can sit there and tell students and staff, well, it's okay to go back now because of that. It's going to be used as another reason to compel people to do things which are unsafe. And I think my sort of big concern is that you have an awful lot of sort of bullying in the background of this now, where institutions are forcing staff to do things because they know they have them over a barrel. Have you found that too, Rich, in terms of your experience of it? About how
it's interesting, because when you were talking about that kind of the intersection of hygiene theatre, but also the kind of it operates in two levels, doesn't it? The kind of the disciplining effectively of staff. It's that kind of, it's almost deeply, sort of Foucauldian on a lot of levels, but there is this kind of sense of people of certain bodies. It's not all bodies, certain bodies in the institution, those who are more precarious, those who are lower down the pecking order, being coerced effectively back into institutions to do unnecessary face-to-face, ostensibly because we do not know what the regulator is going to say if students lodge complaints. So, we want to be the government and the regulator aren't willing to sort of define what a quality student experience is. So everyone's trying to do belt and braces, you know, around it in terms of, well, we did provide you with some face-to-face, you know what I mean? And there is a development of some community, but there's also this kind of internalization, I think, of like, well, you know, everyone else is doing, well, all these other people are doing it. Why aren't, you know, so you need to do it as well, don't you? You know, we are collectively in this together, trying to provide the best student experience. You need to ensure that you're coming in. So I've heard from other institutions, for instance, where even though we're on the academic contract, for instance, I'm not even talking about professional services staff, and it's completely different for our professional service colleagues, you know, for whom there are all sorts of different issues, you know, about being forced back in. But for some of our academic staff, being told they've got to be in 3 days a week, you know, and then sort of saying that, and then the logistics of that, where you're saying, but I've got to come in 3 days a week, but I'm teaching on 2 of those days, and I'm going to be and I share an office, and we teach at the same time, me and Jane Doe. So how are we going to manage that, where we're both doing this kind of thing in a shared, where they're over here and then you haven't got, because of social distancing, you haven't got the rooms that I can book. So on a very low level pragmatic basis, this demonstrates the divorce for me of senior and middle management from the chalk face, that there's no kind of real understanding of what a meaningful student experience might be, of what meaningful access to content, building a learning community, building a learning environment, you know, negotiating that with students, trying to make sense of what that means then for different groups of students. The people who are teaching it are the ones who understand what is going on, but there's just this imposition from on high of what the curriculum and what the student experience should look like, and there's such a mismatch that it ignores the everyday realities, and it puts people at risk without really justifying the decision making. If you could see that, if they showed they're working, you know, you could begin to have a look at it and maybe be justified in it. But actually, and this is one of the things that I think a number of commentators are now pushing at, is the fact that institutions kind of have a really conflicted approach to things like widening participation, or or the relationship between online and face to face. And now they're all suddenly sort of saying, oh well, you know, if we don't provide some face to face, these cohorts of students are going to suffer. But there's no evidence for any of that.
I was just going to say, it's almost like there's a weaponization of student mental health to say that you need to do the face-to-face with masks and that because students need it for their mental health and well-being, which of course overlooks the fact that students who've been trapped in halls of residence, who've not been able to go home, been literally fenced in Manchester with security guards outside, their mental health shot for that reason. Whether or not you teach them in classrooms with masks or not, it's not likely to improve it. And it's almost like universities will pick and choose when mental health is an issue and use that as a way to pressurize staff to do face-to-face that they think is not just unsafe, but also pedagogically meaningless, which obviously is not going to help anyhow. So it's almost like mental health is like a football brought into this game by university management to justify this sort of decision making and this sort of coercive control of staff around these issues.
I agree with you completely. I think actually what you remind me is that the student experience has been weaponized now for decades, frankly, again by management against staff. So it's weaponized through the National Student Survey. It is and that kind of that develops out of the University of Sydney under Paul Ramsden in the 90s. He becomes the head of what then becomes the Institute for Learning and Teaching, becomes the Higher Education Academy, and you're sort of thinking this is supposed to be about the professionalization of kind of teaching staff, but we're using these metrics over here as a means of weaponizing the student experience against staff, and we have seen in institutions reports of where departments have been hauled in because over a one year blip, and we know from all of the stuff that happens in primary and secondary schools about cohort differences, about the need for longitudinal studies, about all that kind of stuff. So you're dead right that actually that doesn't go away inside institutions. I mean, as it happens, I happen to work at the moment inside an institution where that's been handled pretty sensitively. The NSS stuff, I have to say. But I've heard reports from other institutions where that is absolutely not the case, and there's an amplification. So you're dead right that there's a complete kind of almost schizophrenic, or binary, a pair of binaries that are kind of deeply entangled about that whole kind of you got to get them in. You need to get them in for their mental health. At the same time, we have demanded that they move to Manchester, for instance. You know what I mean? For this experience, you've got to go teach them face to face for their mental health. Oh, meanwhile, we're going to be providing them with there've been reports, haven't there, of in certain institutions where halls have gone into lockdown, of over expensive access to kind of food, the halal food not being provided for certain students and communities, for students being kettled effectively, racially profiled. Well, if there are, I mean, I talked to a friend who lives in Liverpool. I know him because he sports the same shonky football team as me. But and he was sort of saying his daughter has gone away to the university, and he is so angry about the fact that he feels like that has been, that's been a contract effectively. Should have been online. Should have been online. She would still have signed up. She would still have gone. She would still have paid a fee. She'd have done it from home. But why didn't we consider any of these other alternatives? Why? Because she got bounced into a hall of residence, and they went into lockdown within 10 days, 2 weeks or whatever. Everything's online. She's effectively kind of imprisoned in that space. Well, if anything's going to damage your mental health, it is the very fact that those people who you thought were there to care about you have shown that they are careless about your well-being.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, I think on the mental health and well-being side, again, it's another thing that it's like a form of hygiene theatre in a different way, arguably, because obviously for staff, the emails that come out, which always emphasize we will take care of staff and student health and well-being, and this is our priority, are invariably followed by, you can use this counselling service online, and that's it. So that's their kind of, their bargain with staff is, for your mental health, just phone that and make a Skype appointment. But we still need to do the face-to-face. We still need to do the things that you may feel very uncomfortable with. And this notion again that people who have no underlying condition, not in at-risk groups, are just COVID nervous. I've heard that phrase used. You just think, well, with very good reason, during a pandemic where people have long COVID and are dying, who are not people who are in vulnerable groups, or you might think would be particularly vulnerable to that condition. You just sort of think, well, COVID nervous is another way of kind of, again, disciplining staff. That's a good way of putting it. About this idea about you kind of put staff in those boxes and make it look as though they're the one with the problem. And of course, always using students as the reason. Students need to see you. So if you don't do that, you're letting them down. Whereas perhaps for most of us, and I'm sure the same, Rich, I mean, my teaching that's online, a lot more effort been put into that than it would be face to face. I mean, I think there's no lack of effort on staff who are having to do things online. In fact, it's a lot more work, but it's safe and every student can participate.
We have no discussion, you're dead right. We have no discussion about collectively about the risk we're willing to bear and why we're willing to bear it and who is willing to bear it. And therefore, you are right. This whole idea of, when you were talking about COVID nervousness, you reminded me of the work of a wonderful woman called Joyce Kanan, who used to work at Birmingham City University. Her work was on kind of critical pedagogy, and she worked with kind of the landless movement in Brazil. But she would write about the kind of the embodied realities of working in the neoliberal university, where there were moments of shame. Certain bodies were shamed. And it's an act of not embarrassing. It's kind of, you need to internalize the shame of your behaviour in order to kind of change your behaviour. And I think this is another one. You're COVID nervous. Well, what's wrong with you? And actually, we've got these other services here. And if you've got, we've put hand sanitizer in, and you can open the windows, and we've allegedly sorted the ventilator. If you get ill, well, what have you been doing? what unnecessary risks have you been taking if you get kind of ill? You know, we've got regular health and safety meetings in this institution, you know, all of this kind of stuff. I think that those are kind of really, that's really important. And the way in which you're dead right, that then gets entangled with the fact that staff are deeply committed. Most staff I know are deeply committed to their students and to engaging meaningfully in the classroom. No one wants to put a duff lecture in. No one wants to have a bad workshop or seminar. No one wants to feel. I mean, I don't know about you. I'm always reading the room. This is one of the issues with online a little bit more, is I'm always reading the room to see who is connecting, who is not, who have I lost because they're on their mobiles or whatever it might be. You know what I mean? And but you are right that we put in so much care to curating that hour or 2 hours, which spills way over the workload allocation for that hour or 2 hours, because we're preparing before, we're finessing during, and if you're like me, I do a recording afterwards, which effectively is a better version. You know, this is what I wish I'd said, or this is what came up, or these are the points you made, and in response to that, I'm going to do this. They get bundles more from me after the fact, you know. So you are dead right. Within this, the argument that you are COVID nervous and that's going to spill through to a bad experience is, it leaves me gobsmacked.
Is it not one step away? And John, you might have had this too. We're getting to the point now where it is mirroring, government and other sections of society, how they've dealt with it, where it's almost like, well, if you got ill, how can you prove it was in the university? How can you prove it was that lecture? Because you had the windows open, you were following or you didn't follow the guidelines and sitting that far apart. And if you didn't wear a mask, it's almost like it's getting that sort of individual responsibility where it's not the institution which is accountable, it's the individual. And of course, the argument then will be, well, how can you prove that you recklessly endangered your health by doing that? Because you could have got that in Tesco's. And again, it's that sort of almost element of trying to escape responsibility. And universities, you think, would be the organizations, perhaps above all else, where societal responsibility would weigh heavier on decision making, that there is that kind of almost effort to sort of escape from that. And I kind of do worry a lot about certainly staff members that I speak to that do genuinely feel that the level of bullying they've had, and again, this is bullying not done in person. This is done via done via meetings, done via email. And it is that sort of, if you don't do it, somebody else will have to do it. So it's almost like a pressure there about, if you don't take responsibility and recklessly endanger yourself, somebody else have to do it. Which again, the morality of that is so twisted and far beyond what we might think university education is supposed to be. It's very worrying.
I think it's an interesting one, because you remind me that in a conference presentation we had this conference on radical pedagogies, maybe September 2019, I think it was. God, that was like a long time ago, right? But whenever that was. But I remember Gurnham Singh from Coventry. He came along and he made this brilliant, impassioned, had been working in higher ed, self-taught, been working in higher education for, I don't know, 30 years, whatever. And I remember him calling universities in what are allegedly the most liberal institutions in the land, and I have heard other colleagues at other institutions who've worked, say, in industry, for instance, saying that the cultures of misogyny and racism and kind of managerialism that borders on bullying and that kind of notion of a kind of toxic environment is way worse in universities than they've experienced in other spaces, and I think that this is really interesting because it brings us into a kind of almost a clash, really, where another entanglement, really, where we have that side of things which are predicated, or they emerge from or erupt from a very competitive environment predicated upon value and value for money and efficiency and all of those things, but effectively generating surplus labor, surplus value, profit, rent, whatever it might be on the one hand. On the other hand, this sense that those of us who are in there still, as bell hooks would argue, care deeply about the souls of our students. We care because there's a reflection of our own souls in those students' souls, and what we want, and therefore we want to nurture that space, you know, and so there's a real kind of clash and entanglement between the drive for economic value and the fact that we're doing this work because we believe in humanity and humane values and mutuality and solidarity and care and respect and all of that. And actually, this is one of the problems with the pandemic, is that we are so torn by, as you say, you have to do it or someone else will have to do it, you know, and all of those diktats and, you know, and keep the show on the road, and there's no alternative on the one hand. And on the other hand, how do I keep myself safe, my loved ones who I've got to care for safe? How do I keep my nan safe? How do I keep my students safe? How do I ensure they get the, you know, and it's so difficult to kind of make sense of that. And it's one of the reasons why people are stressed and stretched, and it's one of the reasons why they're overworking.
I suppose,
and you're right. So I mean, bang on, Rich, in terms of that, and you're right in terms of it almost shames the staff member who actually says, I can't do this. You know, I think it's that sort of, again, that implicit pressure that's put on people at all levels. I mean, yeah, I mean, from talking to people from probationers through to people who are more experienced, there's that sort of expectation that if you break, you're not just breaking that way, but you're also causing somebody else to break. So it's almost becomes that sort of pressure building and building. And during a pandemic where people have so many other things to deal with, you would perhaps hope, maybe optimistically, that would be something they would disregard. But we're still doing ref, TEF, KEF, all those things. Still that work can't get lost, you know, and you sort of sit there and think, surely this year would be the year where somebody says, let's maybe park this and think about the next 12 months in terms of getting through the teaching and getting through what we need to do. But no, we're still working on that kind of neoliberal model.
I was talking to a friend earlier, as it happens, about who works in Scotland in a Scottish institution. He was talking about the fact that he is still working 10 till 4 Saturdays and Sundays in order to get it, because of the imperatives of the research excellence framework. They've got an impact case study and the demands on getting that in, you know, and he's got to do all his other work, and he's got to care with his family, you know, and do all his own social reproduction, and it's just insane, you know, because the treadmill doesn't, you know, it doesn't stop, and if you try to slow it, or you try to put a you know, do the Luddite thing and break the machine a little bit, you know, you're reminded that it's a labor of love. It's a privilege to work here. What are you doing?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, with the ref stuff as well. I mean, I posted a tweet which was a bit sarcastic, but also very true. I do that occasionally, but John knows. But I sort of said about
that comes from your roots, my friend.
Yeah, I know. My Facebook account's far worse, obviously. I mean, ref reviewing work which has already been reviewed and published, by definition, is probably the worst use of time you could ever think of. To explain that to a non-academic, and you explained, yep, you have to go through a publishing model which is unpaid, so that the author's unpaid, the reviewers are unpaid, and then we decide to re-review it again, even though it's already been published, is such an inordinate waste of labor, time, effort, and stress, because obviously what are people being asked to ref review during a pandemic particularly did feel as if that was just kicking people for the sake of it. And to what end? Because again, it's not improving the research, it's not improving the people being reviewed, and it's certainly not improving those who are doing the reviewing. It's another example where the machine just keeps going. You know,
it's one of those. It's yet another one of those kind of estrangements and entanglements, because, you know, we want to collaborate. Really, we want to cooperate and collaborate. We want to come to negotiated potential kind of new paths, alternative paths. We might call them solutions or whatever they might be for particular issues, but we're driven into modes of kind of competition at the level of the individual, the discipline, the institution. So you get academics who in one sense would refuse the TEF, they would refuse the NSS, they would refuse the ref, but they're all in on it, because, you know, the institution, the discipline, their own sense of ego identity almost comes to depend upon it. And so you're dead right that you then get this whole train of redundant, useless labor. And I just kind of think, imagine what we could do with that time. If we could repurpose that time and this is one of the things for me about the kind of pandemic, if you're thinking about where we go, is that there are all of these, if we can invert things, there are all of the, and look at them from the kind of the opposite perspective almost. There are all of these moments in which we could, all of these contradictions all around economic value and humane values, you know, around the fact that our work is sold back to us by publishers or whatever, you know what I mean, in order to generate rents, but it's our work, you know, in the fact that, you know, we're told that our public engagement has to be in some way impactful or about knowledge transfer or knowledge exchange, and it has to be a commodity. Well, actually, there are ways in which we could invert that in order to try to look at the limits of possibility. Is there another horizon we could kind of push towards? Are there other possible outcomes, other possible relationships that could develop here? Other ways of using our knowledge and our skills and our infrastructure? I mean, we're too exhausted to have those conversations, right? We're on the treadmill, keep on the treadmill, you can't get off it. But it strikes me that would be these are possible routes out, to take those pinch points, those fractures, those moments of stress, those moments of whatever, and you know, and have alternative conversations.
I think it's probably an opportunity to really think about where all of that comes from, because if I was to listen to what you guys have just spoken about quite eloquently and obviously very passionately, from you talking about, you know, as people that do it and are actually on the grass at the front line, you know, where the rubber meets the road type thing. And then I look at the third sector, you know, the charities, sort of, you know, NGOs, you know, sort of your local community organisations. This drive to be more business-like, you know what I mean, business practices, you know what I mean, we need to be doing this, we need to be more efficient. Well, if you say that as educators, they've kind of got you, really, because what they're saying is, well, you're going to do that anyway because you're passionate about teaching, that's a vocation. That's people that work in the third sector as well. They care about their service users like you care about your students. So what you've then got, isn't it, which is you can't get off that treadmill, because as someone who works in a charity, well, if you don't do that and burden that almost like, you know, unshoulderable amount of work, your service users are going to suffer. If you don't do it as an educator, your students are going to suffer. So really, we need to wrestle control back from these people in management that for some reason have come from business into education and into the third sector, to turn around and say, well, it's not the quality of your care, it's not the quality of your provision, it's not the quality of your education or your class or your teaching or anything like that. It's all the fact that you need to be more productive. And I think that's where REF and TEF and all those things come from. It's a way of people that don't teach being busy. Because I often say to people, yeah, this is my 5th year at DMU. Every time I stand up and teach, there's 25 people sitting behind me, all can't wait till I finish teaching to send me an email to tell me that I haven't done something right, but none of them could do my job. You know, they're all unable to talk to a room of students. And so you have this pantomime scenario where you meet certain people in institutions who turn around and say to you, those students, they're fantastic. I went on this trip. I went to DMU Global. And I said, well, how many students went? They were 25. So you've met 25 students that chose to do that. Yeah, you haven't sat with the 25 students that were in front of me, maybe one of whom would have been one of those 25. That's the reality of teaching, not what you see in the public facing events of people being held up. And this is where I really push back against the pantomime of open days, because we're selling people the wrong experience. There's never anybody on a poster or, you know, reading a book. Now, I know you can get ebooks and there's new ways of doing it and all that, but the difference between the two and a first is, do you do the recommended reading? You can't even call it essential reading now. It's recommended reading. And this is, for me, I think, where the real frustration comes as an industry practitioner, because I think you've got all of those resources, and then what I'm trying to do here with the Dot Media Centre, or what we've tried to do, Rich, over the years with conversations around the third university, adult education, primary schools, secondary schools, home education. How do you get suddenly universities to go back to the leading role that they should have in being aspirational for people to get involved in doing things on campus, rather than just being something that just does its own thing and doesn't really get involved?
part of the issue is that the institutions have an appearance, don't they? They have an appearance which is kind of disconnected from their essence, really. The kind of so students never get to see on an open day or on a virtual open day or whatever. There is the presentation of a kind of an appearance, a set of characteristics that are kind of presented to parents, and they're presented to young people. And you're right that doesn't, and that's been skewed, right? It's been deformed. It's been deformed in the media. It's been deformed by government and government policy. It gets deformed by the regulator. All of that in terms of really skewing how universities sell themselves, what they say they are, what they say they're for, how they present themselves to a range of kind of stakeholders, which isn't really the kind of tends to fall apart at the level of the everyday. And it isn't necessarily what's happening in that workshop or that studio or in the library at 10:30 at night on a Saturday night when students are in there cramming for that essay that's due in, or whatever it might be, And so there's a kind of disconnect there. I think there's also, there are a whole series of disconnects in that way. Part of this is about the fact that we don't really have an honest set of conversations at the level of society, and I think it's much more important that we do it there, about what the university is for. So even those of us inside the university are angry. We're not struggling. Mike Neary always said the struggle isn't for the university, it's against what the university has become. And part of that, what it's become, is completely divorced from a whole range of stakeholders. The only thing it's really deeply connected into is a kind of a particular agenda around employment, employability, the market, value for money and earnings potential. So all of the stuff that it could do with third sectors, with charities, with communities, all of that possibility, that potential, just gets lost because and part of the reason why it gets lost is because the appearance of the institution eventually distorts the essence of it.
I mean, one of the ways of thinking of it, and I'll just throw this out there and get both of you guys to make a comment on it, and then maybe we'll have some wrapping up comments, because we're coming up for 50 minutes now. I always say to people, I was in the military, but I was in the army part, and the military doesn't exist. It's a term that's thrown over Army, Navy, Air Force, etc., etc. It's a bit like the NHS. You can't go to the NHS headquarters. It's not a place. It's the ambulance service, doctors, hospitals. But when one part of it goes wrong, the NHS gets the kicking. Maybe we need to reimagine what a university is from the point of view that it is a collection of primary schools, secondary schools, businesses, the third sector, and an institution that provides that kind of stuff. Maybe we need to wrestle the word back in order to be able to change what happens next. And what you do is you leave organizations like that now that are driven by, but they are businesses. How can they be described as universities when in fact all they are is education factories? I don't know. You go in. It's a training organisation. Maybe that's how we fight back with no resources at all. Is we fight back to try and wrestle back the term to what it actually means to people. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's content provision. I think the pandemic's kind of exposed that to an extent where people are more worried about the audio track on their recorded lecture being perfect. You sit and think, well, I think that sort of narration is very good for accessibility. And again, there are people who do need that and who obviously might not get that in a face-to-face. Being more obsessed with the optics about whether things look professionalized and again, very corporate. I mean, that's what it is. It's about corporate, using slideshows which have the university template on it, because again, it's a brand, that sort of thing too. I mean, it just sort of, the sort of peak of this for me, and there've been many over the last 6 months, was probably when we decided to survey students who obviously were all remote at this point. This is about April or May. And on the module evaluation, the questions that were added, and I obviously thought we're evaluating a module when we all went back home in March. A lot of our students went to China. They're all in quarantine, but we're going to do module evaluation based on that. And of course, we had to do it. We were forced to do it. And there was a question added, which was, what part of the move to online only teaching did you enjoy the most? And I just sort of thought, the very fact you would ask a question in a global pandemic where students have had to go home in a hurry and asked them what they enjoyed the most about it. And I did sort of raise questions, say, why are we asking questions like this? Where is the empathy? I mean, even going back on a level like that, and Rich, I'm sure you have this too, and John, you have too. We're expected to meet students online to check they're okay, and we even get sort of diktats saying, make sure they're on camera. And I sit and think, it's not my job nor my right to say to someone, show me where you are. If they want to text me, and a few times on that, where we were told we have to have meetings, there are a lot of people dealing with a lot of very difficult situations here, and certainly with students of mine, I have said to them, you don't need to make me for the sake of it, but tell me you're okay. Just send me an email, and if you need me, you know where I am. That level of empathy is just lost. I mean, I think despite all the optics and all the theatre of universities saying that their welfare staff and students is priority, it's pretty abundantly clear that in many cases that's not the case, and almost there's an effort to work against staff and perhaps even to work against students in terms of some of the ways in which they've been treated.
I think that sense of kind of loss as well is amplified because I was minded, John, when you were speaking. You remember this from your reading of Marx, of course, John, that he talks about joint venture companies, associations effectively of kind of capitals of businesses that work together in order to leverage surplus. They work more effectively together. They can open new sectors, new markets, and universities are like this. So universities come to you in association with educational technology suppliers, with publishing companies, with venture capitalists who are investing. If they've got bonds with Moody's, they need a credit rating, with insurers in the bond markets, with corporate providers who demand certification for particular or investing in particular kind of bits of professional development, MBAs, that kind of stuff. So institutions, in the same way that you argued for the National Health Service about the component parts, universities are very complex and sprawling machines for the extraction of value, and in that process they exploit, and in that process, therefore, stuff gets lost, as Paul has said, because the end goal again is economic value rather than humanity and empathy and mutuality and care. And they'll voice that that's what it should be about, but it's on you to provide it, and we're not gonna stop what I've called elsewhere the anxiety machine from kind of moving and maintaining its kind of motive energy through the amplification of anxiety and forms of anxiety over performance and status and health and all of those things. One of the interesting things for me is that because institutions are those associations, those networks of work with food banks, works with charities, works with publishers, works with whatever, all of those deep interconnections. If you could find a way of analysing that and inverting it, there's also there a potential new ecosystem that we could kind of, if we could only expand our horizons, there's a new ecosystem there for new ways of knowing about the world and doing in the world and being in the world and all of that. And I think that means that therefore that we have to see the university as social entities in some way, social networks, and we have to look effectively. I'm very taken at the moment with work around mycorrhizal kind of networks and kind of fungal networks or networks that can decompose stuff and recycle nutrients, and what is it that we can recycle from the university into society in order to reimagine it, and I think that the intersection of COVID and financial crisis has made that more imperative, but it's also revealed the ways in which the university will discipline us, will harm us, for profit, and we need to find ways of resisting and I guess of switching that, and seeing that it's entangled with our humanity. How do we reveal our humanity and do something different? And I don't have a sense that that's easy, right? And there ain't a blueprint, and there certainly isn't a utopia I would want to define, but we need and deserve to have the conversation. And at the moment, we're not allowed to have that conversation.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the conversation with students, and I think, I've been pleased to see some NUS spokespersons on TV saying why are we paying fees full stop? Not just talking about the value for money argument and getting refunds, just saying we shouldn't be paying fees in the first place, which again was refreshing given what we hear from OFS and those things too, where it's almost assumed that any student and their parents is only about the value for money, the job at the end of it, and the amount of debt that they incur. And also with the pandemic, they're not getting their gym, their access to the facilities. I mean, again, the facilities, not the education, the facilities, the buildings. And John, you and I talked about it before. A university isn't just about the shiny new library or the gym or the sports facilities. You know, it should be about the education, which of course doesn't necessarily need to have buildings at all.
Well, you're talking about the whole kind of the map and the rest of the world, people sitting under trees learning to read and write, people sitting in low resource settings, people sitting in refugee camps, all of whom are, desperate to gain education. And here we're talking about, the complete other end of it, which is managers telling us what we can and can't teach and what we should be teaching. But there we go, guys. That's an hour. Good grief.
Oh, brilliant.
Put the world to rights. Cool. And Rich, just one final thing to sum up. The book that you're making some progress on. You gave the editors a date of it will be ready at Christmas today. So I think this is probably a good time for you to tell us a little bit about what it is and when we can expect to see it.
Well, it's I wrote a book a couple of years ago about academic work, which is called The Alienated Academic. So that takes a kind of a humanist approach to kind of academic work, a Marxist humanist approach to that, and tries to look at the ways in which intellectual work, work in a university, what it does to us, what it does to us and our communities really, and also the environment. How our work is kind of taken from us, our knowledge is taken from us, they make a profit from it, and we're contractually obliged to do that. So the unit of analysis there was the individual academic. Now the unit of analysis is the university. So the title is The Hopeless University, because as my sister says, I only trade in really upbeat titles for things. So it's The Hopeless University, and it's called Intellectual Work at the End of History. It kind of works with this idea, I guess, that was made popular by Fukuyama, about that we're at the end of history, that now the Berlin Wall has fallen, that capitalism has won, that capitalism and the production of value is the only game in town. There's no alternative, in Thatcher's words. Only the pandemic, financial crisis, ecological crises, Black Lives Matter, all of these things reveal that actually we have agency, that we have the ability as individuals to co-create and negotiate alternatives, that they aren't just given down. We don't just have to go to work. Actually, is it possible for us to imagine another world? And if we're going to do that, and if we're going to do that as people who work in universities, and that's students, professional services staff and academics, what does that look like? What is the role of the university in that? Because at the moment, the university seems to be hopeless in that it is devoid of hope, and hopeless in that it is useless for solving any of these crises that are effectively diminishing the possibility for life on this planet. If we think ecologically, we just hope we can ignore it or annihilate it, or that the boffins will come along and find a solution that will be outsourced. There's no sense of a kind of a deeper societal, communal conversation about how do we want to live in this world? What is the point of living in this world? And what is the role, therefore, of the university in that? So that's what I'm writing about. It'll go to the editors before Christmas, should be out, I guess, kind of early 2021, unless they say that it's absolute rubbish and they're not going to publish it. One of the other things I think that's important about it, finally, is that it is with a radical press called Mayfly Books, who they publish a journal called Ephemera, which is a radical journal of organisation and management. It's 10 quid for if you want print on demand, it's 10 quid. Otherwise, it is EPUB, it is downloadable, it's going to be open access, because one of the critical things is that too much academic publishing, books are 60, 70, 80 quid, you might be able to get them paperback for 20 or whatever, and that just doesn't open up a conversation, and that's what I wanted to do.
Cool. well, hopefully you'll come back and talk to us again when it's published. And of course, there'll be somewhere on a bookshelf here for it to slide into nicely and be part of the archive and library at the Doc Media Centre. It could be great. Listen, mate, thank you very much for taking the time. Paul and I are absolutely delighted that you were up for having a conversation for us today. Any final comments from you, Paul?
No, thanks, Rich. That was really, really good to have that conversational, and looking forward to the book. I mean, it's going to be a great read.
Awesome. Thank you for the invite. It's very kind. It's lovely to be asked to do this on a Friday as well. You know, it's a really nice conversation to have. So I thank you ever so much for your generosity.
Cool.
Thanks, Rich.